Coming up with Primetime Lawmakers, long-awaited tax reform passes the House overwhelmingly. The extensive overhaul will tax internet purchases and casual car sales, but abolish the ad valorem tax on cars and lower some income taxes. The $19.2 billion FY 2013 budget passes the Senate Appropriations Committee. Senate Appropriations Chairman Jack Hill says the budget funds growth in education, Medicaid, and other key areas. A vote in the full Senate is expected on Thursday. Georgians receiving benefits like food stamps or welfare will have to submit to drug testing under legislation considered by a House committee today. And the state owes the federal government millions of dollars, hundreds of million, money loaned to the Unemployment Trust Fund. It's solvent during the recent recession that went insolvent. Tonight, we'll be joined live on set by State Labor Commissioner Mark Butler and Clare Richie, Senior Policy Analyst with the Georgia Budget and Policy Institutes, an issue that touches thousands of Georgia working families. For Tuesday, March 20th, 2012, the 35th Legislative Day of the Georgia General Assembly, this is Primetime Lawmakers. Good evening and welcome to Primetime Lawmakers, GPB's nightly coverage of the Georgia General Assembly. I'm Scott Slade. Let's go live to the Capitol where Sandra Parrish reports tax reform is finally here and it passed the House.
Yes, Scott, with bipartisan support, the measure passed overwhelmingly in the House with no one speaking against it on the House floor.
I had concerns last year and I was proud this year to see HB 386 because we operate under a system that needs reform.
House Minority Leader Stacey Abrams and other Democrats joined with Republicans in supporting the measure.
I think this is perhaps one of the most fairest attempts at addressing tax legislation that I have been a part of in this body in the last 6 to 8 years. What we did not do in this bill is try to go and pick winners and losers.
The bill sailed through at lightning speed, passing a joint House and Senate committee just this morning, one day after it was introduced.
It reduces taxes to individuals by over $100 million over a 3-year period of time. It eliminates the birthday tax on vehicles. It reinstates the sales tax holiday for school supplies and energy-efficient products. It moves forward on Governor Deal's pledge to promote families by reducing the marriage penalty in the state income tax code. On the pro-jobs front, it creates a more favorable environment for businesses located in Georgia by finally getting rid of the tax on energy and manufacturing.
The main opposition found today was by a coalition of conservative groups, including the Tea Party.
We just want to be part of the process and get the input of grassroots activists. And we have been told from the very beginning that they were not even sure if they were going to get to tax reform this year. And if this is an up or down vote, and that is the only choice that we have here, we say vote it down. We say as a coalition, vote this down. And then let's go back to the table and do something that's meaningful that we can all get behind.
This bill in some form has been out there about 92% in its form now for 2 years. 2 years. So I do take a little bit of offense, I guess, when I hear people say that we are kind of rushing the process.
Now, the measure passed 155 to 9 and will immediately be transmitted to the Senate, where we're hearing it could be taken up on Thursday. The House also passed a bill today that puts cell phones in the same category as contraband in the juvenile justice system.
Cell phones are not currently included in the law, and therefore we're defining it as contraband, and we're also looking at the fact of how it threatens the security as well as the safety of our youth, our employees that are involved, as well as the public.
The measure passed with only one vote against it and now goes to the governor's desk. The House Judiciary Civil Committee could vote tomorrow on a Senate bill to require welfare recipients to undergo drug testing. Time ran out today before testimony could be heard, but sponsor Senator John Albers did take questions from committee members.
What is the specific problem that this bill is trying to correct?
Mr. Representative, I think it's important that whenever the state spends tax dollars, that we do so in a good fiduciary manner. Each one of us took an oath to the state to make sure that we would make sure we're good stewards of those tax dollars. In the private marketplace and in public service today, or civil jobs, we already require people to drug test. And the last thing we'd ever want to do is someone to receive a state benefit and use that for illegal activities.
We think that this bill is very punitive. We think that it discriminates not only against poor people, but it discriminates against people who may have a substance abuse problem. And we think it further stigmatizes addiction, and it doesn't support recovery.
And Scott, more testimony from others expected tomorrow who are opposed to that bill.
Sandra, I want to go back to the massive tax reform bill that passed the House overwhelmingly today. Because of the way it was written, it can't be amended. That'll be the case in the Senate, too. Last time, this whole thing got derailed because of sales tax and services, like haircuts and oil changes. Does this bill even deal with the sales tax and services?
No, it doesn't. That was left out of the bill. And actually, a lot of the controversy last year centered around the income tax reductions as well. A lot of emphasis was placed on the middle class, maybe actually having to pay more instead of having their taxes cut. That was left out of the bill. And actually, they said on the House floor today that this is not a comprehensive tax plan like they tried to pass this year. But they said it is definitely a start. All right,
the process started more than 2 years ago. That tax commission with A.D. Frazier. Thanks very much, Sandra. Now, an update on a bill we reported in yesterday's program. The so-called fetal pain abortion bill passed the Senate Health and Human Services Committee late yesterday afternoon by a close voice-only vote. The bill would limit the time a woman could have an abortion from 26 to 20 weeks, the threshold where supporters say fetuses can begin to feel pain. No exceptions are made for cases of rape or incest. Today, Senator Nan Orrick of Atlanta warned her colleagues to remember the women in their districts when the bill makes it to the floor.
Women across Georgia are watching. They filled the room last night. The newspapers and the airwaves will be filled as this bill moves forward. Beware of waking the sleeping giant, because people who pay no attention to politics and to 90% of what we do down here, when you start telling them you're going to jail, you're going to put doctors in prison, and you're going to be the judge over telling a doctor what medical procedure they can or cannot use. Be very, very careful. And that is advice that I think wears equally well on both sides of the aisle.
Having already passed the House, the measure will now be considered by the Senate Rules Committee for placement on the Senate calendar. Passing a balanced budget is the only thing lawmakers are constitutionally required to do. Today, the 2013 budget cleared a major hurdle in the Senate. Let's head back to the Capitol, where Sasha Horn has more on the Senate's progress. Sasha.
Scott, members of the Senate's Appropriations Committee say the 2013 budget, totaling some $19.2 billion, is focused on keeping up with the fast growth in the state. Now, some areas of growth include education, both grade school and college, Medicaid, and the Senate health care plan. Chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Senator Jack Hill, says they're using all available resources to keep up with the fast pace.
The 2013 budget is all about growth and funding the growth of a growing state. And funding that growth took virtually all of the resources that we had available. These are real needs, and the funding based on real growth. From population growth, which has totaled well over 100,000 in population just since the census was done 2 years ago. The challenge of growth in this state has demanded most of our available resources.
And with just 5 days left in the session, the budget now goes on to the full Senate for their consideration. And reforming Georgia's criminal justice system is something that's been in the work for some time. Late this evening, the Special Joint Committee on Criminal Justice Reform combed through more than 50 pages of legislation focused on giving Georgia's criminal justice system a facelift. Now, to get insight on which aspects of the current system needed improvement, lawmakers talked with judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys. Some of the proposed changes included revisions to the mental health system, creating a weight-based scale when dealing with drugs, and creating a system to combat organized crime affecting retail stores. Now, that measure cleared committee after only about an hour of discussion and is expected to be considered in the House on Wednesday. And the Senate also voted on to create the Georgia Vocational Rehabilitation Services Board today. Now, this 9-member committee will be appointed by the governor and will take over disability services. For example, the management of the Roosevelt Warm Springs Institute and the Georgia Industries for the Blind from the Department of Labor. Now, this legislation Governor Deal has publicly supported, and it will now head to his desk for signature. And wine tastings was also in the Senate. It's already legal here in Georgia, but only for stores that do not sell liquor. Today, the Senate passed a bill designed to allow package stores to host tastings, but not without a little debate.
This is a bill that is supported by the Gucci loafer-wearing liquor lobbyists who are looking down upon us. But an ounce of hypocrisy is worth a pound of ambition, because while they think it's okay for there to be liquor tastings in the state of Georgia, and while it's perfectly okay for a wine store to have wine tastings, or a wine and beer merchant to have wine tastings, this is simply about the ability to have wine tastings in a store that sells wine in addition to spirits.
Now, that measure went on to pass 34-14 and now heads to the governor's desk. And in other food and beverage related Senate news, who doesn't love a good old Georgia-grown Vidalia onion? Now, these onions are famous, even appearing in the popular movie Shrek. And today, the Senate easily passed a bill that would remove a cap on the royalties that can be received from the Vidalia name. Now, those royalties go on to protect trademark infringement. For example, so you'll know whether or not you're buying an authentic Georgia-grown onion. Now, that bill is also on its way to the governor's desk. Clearly a busy day here on the Senate side. Scott?
It really is 5 days left. Thanks, Sasha. And now a reminder, there is much more video and information available on our website. Extended interviews, complete shows, and live House and Senate streams are available online at gpb.org/lawmakers. Also, you can like Primetime Lawmakers on Facebook. Keep up with the Capitol News even before we go to air. Online or off, Primetime Lawmakers is your source for all the news under the Gold Dome. Georgia's unemployment trust fund is in serious peril, according to State Labor Commissioner Mark Butler. The fund is a three-tiered problem, a $762.5 million debt to the federal government. Interest payments on that loan, the first $24 million of which is due this fall. And in Commissioner Butler's words, the fund is broke. So how do we get to this point, and where do we go from here? Tonight, I'm joined live by Georgia Labor Commissioner Mark Butler and Clare, Richie, a senior policy analyst for the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. Thank you both for being with us this evening.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
This is obviously a question. It's one of those, gorillas in the room, isn't it? I mean, $762 million is a fairly serious chunk of change to owe the federal government when we still got a jobs problem. And I'd like to start with how indeed we did get here. Commissioner Butler, why don't we start with you? How did we get in this kind of shape?
Well, we have to go back several years back during Governor Barnes' administration. There was a proposal floated and passed that basically put a moratorium on the unemployment tax for Georgia businesses across the state that went on for around 5 years. During that moratorium, the trust fund lost about $1.2 billion. It had gotten up to right around $2 billion, which at that time most people thought was plenty of money to have in there, or too much to have in there. After we came out of that moratorium, we hit a little recession, and that drained even more out. Then we had a few good years, and then we hit this recession. And by the time we got to this recession, the trust fund had only gotten up to about $900 million. Which was drained very quickly. We had some of the biggest hits our trust fund has ever had in the history of it in 2007, 2008, and completely drained everything that was in the trust fund. And at that point, because of Georgia's Constitution and also due to the fact of lack of having state dollars that could be used for it, the only recourse that we have to have money in our trust fund that pays out the actual benefits would be to go to the federal government and borrow from them. And so at that point, that's when it started. Before I was put into office is when this borrowing started.
If I could, I
Certainly.
think the unemployment tax holiday was certainly an unprecedented tax cut, but we had 9 years after it ended in 2003 in which Georgia continued to have continue to have tax cuts rather than looking at the health of the trust fund and allowing an automatic increase to go into effect. Those increases were suppressed for 9 years.
For 9 years. Well, why didn't we do anything about it sooner, Commissioner Butler?
Well, I'd have to say during my experience in General Assembly, basically it was lack of information. I mean, what we were told from the only source that we can get it from, the Labor Department, that when they would propose different cuts, we would ask, is this okay? Is this what we need to be doing? And the answer was, yeah, we'll be okay. But I think it's fair to say that nobody predicted or saw the type of recession that we have experienced here in Georgia with the massive loss of jobs. I don't think anybody could have predicted that. Nobody would have thought that we would have had a recession that lasted this long and hit Georgia this hard. So, you know, at that time, using the information they had, predicting it, they would think, if everything went on like it was, then the trust fund would have eventually filled itself up. However, that's not what happened. So, I mean, you really can't really blame anybody on that, because I don't think you can really blame anybody for the recession the way it was.
Ms. Richie, establishing the fact that we've got a problem, what's your organization's thinking on where we ought to go from here? I mean, how should we fix it?
Well, right now there is a bill under consideration. It's Senate Bill 447, and we think that that's the wrong approach. It's under consideration in the House right now, and we think there's an opportunity to fix that. Unfortunately, the way the bill's crafted right now, 2/3 of the cost of the bill will be borne by the unemployed through cuts in the maximum weeks they would be eligible for. It would go from 26 weeks down to 12 to 20, which is the lowest in the country. It would also impose a waiting week, which is essentially an elimination of a week for half the unemployment benefit recipients. So we think that this is the wrong approach. Employers under this bill would see a very modest increase in contributions that would still be well below the Southern average. So we think that we should look at the Southern average and say, if Georgia moved to that average, would we be able to protect unemployment insurance benefits? The answer is yes. So we could expand that modest increase in a way that would protect unemployment insurance benefits.
Can we afford to do that, Commissioner Butler, and make this work, make 447 work, the plan that folks have seen on the screen just a moment ago?
Well, how we've looked at this problem is we've tried to come up with a balanced approach. Georgia, like I said before, was hit especially hard during this recession. Businesses, we are starting to see some recovery right now. We've had unemployment dropping for the last 6 months, and hopefully we're going to see that to be 7 months. And what we were looking at is a way to spread out the burden. I mean, the state's having to pick up the cost for the interest, which, like you said earlier, is about $24 million.
First next payment,
right, next payment. And then we looked at cuts in benefits, along with some increases on the state unemployment tax. Plus, not to forget, every employer in the state of Georgia, no matter what your experience is, whether you've laid off one person or you've laid off 100, or if you've laid off any, you've had to experience an increase in the federal unemployment tax. And they will see that tax increased again next year, which we do not have any control over. And that's one of the motivations behind us pushing to get something done now. Because every year that we hold a balance to the federal government, they will continue to increase the federal unemployment tax to get that money back. They're going to get it back one way or the other.
One more thing here. Let's move on. I want to get Ms. Ritchie's take on this in just a moment. Is there another funding source available to help Georgia's unemployment fund? I mean, do we go back to the federal government, for instance? Would that be a dangerous thing to do?
Well, no, I mean, this is an insurance system. It's basically a system that exists between an employer and an employee. And so this is an employer-funded system. It's what it has been since its inception. And Georgia is a low unemployment insurance tax state. We are the 47th lowest unemployment insurance tax state in 2011. So for us to make a modest increase that brings our taxable wage base to the Southern average of $11,500 is not going to be a dramatic increase. We're asking families in this bill, if they have their benefit weeks cut, and the implementation is July, so a family in August would see their benefits cut, could be up to $1,820 for a family. And on top of that, the federal benefits that have been a safety net during the recession, those are temporary, and those end in 2012. So we can't turn to the feds and say, well, backfill the cuts that we're about to make. So the bottom line is we're asking the unemployed to solve a problem that they didn't create. And these employers have drained billions of dollars out of the trust fund for more than a decade, and it's time for them to step up at least to what the Southern average, what we can see from the data is what these other states are doing, and they're able to do that. We know that there are 38 states that owe money to the federal government, and we're the only state that's considering this year a cut to unemployment
benefits. All right, well, we'll need to leave it right there. Just a few seconds for Commissioner Butler here. The progress of the bill, it's in committee now. What happens next? 447, the fix.
Well, it's still in committee, and it's supposed to have a hearing, I believe, on Thursday. And so, we'll have to wait and see if there's any changes on it then. But however, we like to say is we're not the only state looking at cutting benefits. There are several others that are doing the same thing. Matter of fact, some of the ideas that we got for our bill for our changes to our system were from other states like Florida, South Carolina, and others that are having the same problems that we are.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for weighing in on this. It's very important. Appreciate that. Appreciate you being here. And now primetime lawmakers Jackie Britton joins us live for the Capitol with other headlines from around the state. What's going on, Jackie?
Thanks, Scott. Here are your state headlines for tonight. A warm winter is sending pollen counts soaring to record levels in Georgia. Officials from the Atlanta Allergy and Asthma Clinic said today that they measured a record high pollen count of 9,369 particles of pollen per cubic meter. Allergist Dr. Stanley Feynman said that doctors have never seen the levels this high and that allergy patients are having more difficulties this year. And it was a sad day in sports when legendary sports writer Furman Bisher died of a massive heart attack at age 93 on Sunday. Bisher retired in 2009 after writing with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for 59 years, writing his final column on the same typewriter he used in 1950. The AJC reported that Bisher wrote hundreds of articles for national magazines, including Sports Illustrated and the Saturday Evening Post. For more information on these and other stories, visit www.gpb.org/news. And that will do it tonight for your state headlines. Scott, we'll send it back to you.
Thanks, Jackie. I got to thank you, from Furman Bisher, written on that typewriter. It's one of my prized possessions. We got to take a short break on Primetime Lawmakers, but don't go anywhere. When we come back, I'll be joined by Walter Jones, Bureau Chief for Morris News Service. The best analysis and broadcasting on deck. We've got to talk tax reform. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Primetime Lawmakers. Time for our reporter discussion, part of the show where we tap our stable of the best political journalists in the state. Tonight, I'm joined by Walter Jones of Morris News Service, a fellow Griffinite. I wonder if people know we're both from the same hometown.
Oh, same street even.
That's right, Pine Ridge Road. How about that? Well, this is more than you want to know about us. Let's talk about what's going on in the state legislature. As big as this tax reform package is, to pass the House overwhelmingly in 155-9, I have to ask you, in all this time you've covered the legislature, were you surprised that something this big happened this fast?
I really was, Scott, because, well, it's unusual that something this big doesn't have some controversy in it. And the question I keep having is, what is it we don't know about it?
What's in the bill?
Yeah, what may be in the bill that people just haven't figured out. You remember last year, they got awfully close, and then somebody did some figuring and found out, boy, this is going to tax the middle class, and they put the brakes on. So you wonder, well, have they done all that figuring, or is it still yet to be done because it's been sort of rushed out?
Sandra Parrish said something interesting. We were just chatting back and forth from the Capitol a little earlier this evening on this program when I asked about objections that came up before over sales taxes on services, for instance, haircuts, oil changes like that. She said, well, one of the reasons there's no controversy is it wasn't in the bill. And they also seem to have fixed that middle class patch that you mentioned too, somehow in there. I'm not quite sure what the actuary said about it. It'll be interesting to see the final scoring on that bill, won't it?
There's a certain amount of hocus pocus about it, and and maybe it is magic. The stats that the financial backing numbers really weren't made available to reporters very quickly early on in the process. So there may still be a lot of analysis, and sometimes it's just a comma in the wrong place can make a big difference in a bill like this. And of course, they can't amend it. The way they put it together 2 years ago, and I'm not sure they're eager to do this again, but it's an up or down vote.
And it came from that task force, came from the tax council, that tax commission that A.D. Frazier headed, with lots of blue ribbon input, before it ever got to the floor. And so Speaker Ralston pointed out today that, look, this isn't anything new. We've been working on this for more than 2 years, but apparently they shaved the sides of it enough to make it fit. So there wasn't a lot of objection to it this time.
No, it was a love fest. As a reporter, it was kind of boring to cover something like that. Because you keep thinking there's another side. Obviously, one other side that is out there is the Amazon.com folks. They're not happy with it.
Internet sales taxes, e-fairness, right?
And it's not going to tax every internet. Well, the Republicans would argue that every transaction is already taxed. Either your the merchant either takes the money out, or as a consumer you're supposed to submit it to the state. Well, nobody does that, but So they say this isn't a new tax, but it will be a new collection of the tax.
All right, this is huge. We're going to ask one more thing about this before we move on. Do you see a lot of opposition in the Senate, or will it be will the skids be greased and it blows on through before the end of the session?
No, I think it's pretty much greased. I think it's going to go through. For example, I talked this afternoon to Hardy Davis, who's a senator from Democratic senator from Augusta, and he said, "This is huge for Augusta. We've got a lot of manufacturing. We have the #1 user of energy in Augusta. There's a big factory over there," and he said, "We couldn't be happier."
You see any big problems for the big budget, the 2013 budget in the Senate, or will they just get that all worked out and wind up in a conference committee to get the edges of that done?
Again, there's not a whole lot of money to fight over, and so from what I'm hearing, they'll find something to argue a little bit about, but I think that's going to go through too.
Drug testing for public benefits, and the House Judiciary Committee today, the vote may come in committee tomorrow. They had a hearing today about that. What are you thinking? Is there the political will to do anything with that?
Yeah, it's funny. It's almost like two legislatures this year. You have the pragmatic legislature that I think is basically being driven by the governor, which is doing things like the tax reform, the justice reform, and getting everybody on board. And then you have kind of a philosophical group like these drug testing for benefits and the abortion bill, and hugely controversial and clamorous, and lots of fights. Of course, the Republicans have the votes, so they're winning those. But it's almost like, well, Governor Deal's world is boring, and everybody's happy, and things are just rocking along. And then there's this other world in the legislature.
And the abortion bill, as we heard earlier tonight, there's going to be some static about that in the Senate. We're talking about the fetal pain bill.
Oh, yeah, certainly. That's going to be a long debate, and because they made a minor amendment in the Senate committee, it means we get to do it all over again in the House.
Anything you're looking for, big? Anything else coming out of the pipe as a surprise in the last few days?
There's an interesting bill. It's getting the nickname the developer bailout bill. And it has really got the financial lobbyists spooked. They're worried about it because what it would do is essentially give a discount on how much you would owe. If I were a developer and I've made a personal commitment, pledging my personal assets for this loan, and then I go bad on the loan, and they're sell it to somebody who's collecting, they're limiting how much that person can collect from me.
And anytime you get in the middle between a bank and a borrower, well, things get interesting. We'll watch that. We brought this up last night too. Thanks for mentioning that. Good to see you again, Walter.
Same here.
Coming up tomorrow on Lawmakers, a vote is expected of the bill to require drug testing for Georgians receiving public benefits. We'll have complete coverage of that story, plus all the latest news from under the Gold Dome tomorrow on Primetime Lawmakers, 7 p.m. Live coverage of tomorrow's and everyday session is available on our website at gpb.org/lawmakers. And while you're there, check out our extended interviews and other videos, legislative coverage 24/7 at gpb.org/lawmakers. And as long as you're online, like us on Facebook too. If you missed any part of this broadcast, you can catch Primetime Lawmakers tomorrow at 5:30 a.m. Next to GPB, Georgia Outdoors, a viewer favorite, bats. Sharon Collins gets down and dirty with some of the most misunderstood creatures on earth. Georgia Outdoors, bats here on GPB. That's our program. Have a good night.
This is a GPB original production.